Hello and welcome to the Denodo Data Virtualization for Architects class. My name is Paul Moxon. I'm the Senior Vice President of Data Architectures here at Denodo, and I'm going to be your host and your instructor as we go through the various modules of this course. This course is intended to give you an understanding of data virtualization, not necessarily from a product level, but more from a usage level, how you use it, where you would use it, what sort of use cases, scenarios you would use it, and also some technical information which will help you understand why the product can fit in all of these different use cases and scenarios. We'll talk about performance optimization, we'll talk about using MPP engines, etc., so that you can understand the capabilities and the power of data virtualization and the Denodo platform specifically, so that when you do talk to your colleagues, your clients, etc., you understand how and where it's best to use data virtualization, but also perhaps where you shouldn't use data virtualization. So if we look at the different modules that we'll be covering during this class, you should be able to see them on the screen now. We'll start off with an introduction to data virtualization for architects. This is a fairly introductory level module. It's intended to make sure everybody understands what data virtualization is and how it works before we actually start looking deeper into the technology behind it. So if you are familiar with data virtualization, if you do understand how it works, etc., just bear with us as we go through this first module. The second module is a very complementary module to that. I actually put the two together as introductory modules. The first one explains what data virtualization is and how it works. The second one will actually go and look at the tool. And this is where you can also look at your sandbox environment as well. In this second module, data virtualization in action, we'll take a little bit deeper of a dive into how data virtualization works. Then we'll go into the tool and actually see it and go through an example of building a very, very simple project, just connecting a couple of data sources, combining some data, and then exposing it and accessing it through BI tools like Power BI or even Excel, just to show how easy it is with the drag and drop point and click tools within the Denodo platform. After that, the next module is the data architecture patterns, where we look at the different use cases for using data virtualization, whether it's building logical data architectures like logical data warehouses, building data lakes and having a data access layer on top of your data lake to hide the complexity of the data lake from your users, self-service initiatives, data marketplaces, exposing data as services, cloud migration, things like that. That's what we'll cover in that module. The next module is actually broken up into two parts to give you a bit of a break in between them. We start off with performance. This is the first of the technical deep dives into what happens behind the scenes under the covers of the data virtualization platform when you go and get data from it, when you send a query to it, when you request data. This is broken into two parts because it's a very long module. The break is a nice chance to sort of go away, think about what you've learned about in that first module, and then in the second module, we'll expand on that, we'll build on that. So the first module looks at query optimization. It looks at query rewriting and delegation, one of the primary optimizations within the data virtualization platform. The second part of this module, performance part 2, we'll actually go and look at some more advanced optimization techniques, such as offloading processing onto an MPP cluster, such as a Hadoop cluster. We'll look at caching, and we'll look at building what I call smart summaries, cached aggregations of data to accelerate the queries. We'll cover all that in part 2 of performance. The sixth module, metadata management and data catalog. Data virtualization platforms are metadata engines. They live off metadata. They ingest metadata, they create metadata, they use metadata in all sorts of wonderful ways. And this is what we'll talk about in this module. We'll talk about what type of metadata is ingested and created by the data virtualization platform, and then how it's used both within the data virtualization platform itself for things like data lineage, but also externally with third-party tools like data governance tools, data modeling tools, how we can import models from third-party tools and suck in the metadata from tools like Irwin or ER Studio. In the second part of that module, we'll also look at the Denodo Data Catalog. It's a great tool for doing self-service initiatives, for doing data marketplaces, and we'll look at the capabilities of the data catalog because it's one of the primary users of metadata within the data virtualization platform. Module number 7, security and data privacy. If you're going to use the data virtualization platform as a data access layer between your data sources and your users, exposing more data from more of these data sources to your users, you want to be able to control what they can do. You want to control their access to that data. And that's what we'll talk about in security and data privacy. And we'll also look at how you can protect data, PII data, using data masking, using encryption, using tokenization, etc. And then the final module, the deployment architectures module. First of all, we'll start off by looking at the different components that make up the data virtualization platform. What are the moving parts? What are the bits you need to control and manage? Some of them we'll have talked about and we'll have covered already, but there's going to be a few which we haven't really gone into in any detail, and we'll just briefly mention those, explain what they are. And then we'll look at the different ways you can deploy the data virtualization platform, starting off with a single instance, just a standalone singleton, going through high availability, through clustering into highly distributed architectures, multi-cloud architectures, and how you can scale that out. And then that will be it, and you will have finished and survived the class. Congratulations. Now, you should have also received an email giving you information about how to access a virtual sandbox that we have set up for you. This virtual sandbox is there so that you can follow along with the examples and actually try out some of these examples yourself. So, for example, when we go through that data virtualization in practice module, that's that second module, and we go through a simple example, you can actually go through the simple example yourself in your virtual sandbox environment. Similarly, when we look at performance optimizations and we look at, say, offloading processing onto an MPP cluster, a Hadoop cluster, the sandbox environment allows you to run that same query yourself, and you can actually see how the data virtualization platform creates Parquet files, copies them across to our Hadoop cluster, and then executes the final processing, taking advantage of the power of that MPP engine in our Hadoop cluster. So this virtual sandbox is for you. There are some shared virtual databases, some shared examples where you can run queries against them, but obviously you can't create or change them. But then you have your personal environment, your personal virtual database, which is where you can go and build your own views, and you can actually follow along and look at the simple example we do in that second module. So let's go and have a look at the virtual sandbox environment, just so you're familiar with what you're going to be using. So this is the logon screen for the Denodo Design Studio. This is the tool you'll use in your sandbox environment. I've got the same tool here with the same layout that you'll have for your virtual sandbox environment. During the examples, I would use another tool, the administration tool, because I want to be able to disable certain features of query optimization. I have to do that as an administrator. But for some of the examples and all the examples that you can run, which we'll highlight during the actual course materials, you will be using the Design Studio. So if I log into the Design Studio, you can see this is our Design Studio environment. On the left-hand side, you see all of these virtual sandboxes. All of them, except the one with your own username, are shared environments, and you can actually run queries, you can run examples, performance optimization examples, looking at hybrid multi-cloud environments and being able to do queries which will get data from Azure in Germany without ever having a connection to Azure in Germany. Connections to Salesforce, connections to Kafka, so you can do messaging examples, etc. These are all built into your virtual sandbox environment. And your personal virtual database, this is the one where you can create and build your own views using the Denodo tool, using the Denodo platform. In here, the data virtualization in action subfolder is intended to allow you to build that simple example we'll do in that second module. The Kafka example allows you to look at reading data from Kafka topics, getting information from the Kafka message, and then integrating, using that to actually go and query Salesforce. So enriching messaging coming from streaming messaging systems. So there's some very broad examples, some very good examples that you can follow along, and we'll go through each of the areas for your samples in the actual class, and you'll also have a guide to the virtual sandbox environment. This is to help you understand it. And this is quite an extensive guide. It goes through the basic motions of logging into your design studio and running queries so that you can actually see how this is working. It also gives you a tour of the virtual database so you know what is in each virtual database. So you can actually see, okay, this is the virtual database, the admin one, this is it. And this little book icon actually goes and tells you which module of the architect class this is actually covered in. So this one is covered in, this particular example query here is covered in security and data privacy. So obviously in the security and data privacy module, we'll have a reference to an example, a sample, and we'll say you can go and run this in your sandbox environment yourself. And we can go through this with all of these different modules, all of these different virtual databases where they're actually going to see them. And this is the unique virtual database, the one that's in your name, where you can build your own views and try out the capabilities of data virtualization on the connections, the data source connections you've already been provided with. So I hope that gives you an overview of your virtual sandbox environment. I hope you will use it and take advantage of it as we go through the data virtualization class, as we go through the various modules. And like I say, we will point out where we have examples that you can run yourself in your environments. Now it's probably time for you to go on and start with that first module, Introduction to Data Virtualization for Architects.